Hey everybody, welcome back to Post Status Draft. I don't even know what to characterize this interview, Brian, but I've got a very old, longtime friend. Not that he's old, just that we go way back to when I started with WordPress. I found this guy named Brian Gardner, and so I thought, who better to talk about with WordPress being 20 this year, our 20th anniversary. Brian, who was instrumental in a lot of things that helped build and grow this cool ecosystem we call the business of WordPress. But anyway, Brian, welcome back. I think you've been interviewed before, probably like by Brian or somebody, but welcome to the Post Status Draft podcast.
Thank you for having me. One point of clarification, I am old. I'm 48, nearing 50. And in today's terms, and even as it relates to WordPress and people who are in this ecosystem, I'm old and I'm okay with that, because with that comes wisdom and experience and the ability to shepherd. So I embrace the stage of life that I'm in.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, when we first started and met, we were in our 30s. Now we're in our 40s. And it's like, I thought there's a nostalgic fact to that. Absolutely. But also, yeah, you've been there and seen things evolve over the years. Okay, so thank you for that. Thank you for being on today. I wanted to talk a little bit about the past, and tell me how you found WordPress. I don't even know if I know the story, by the way.
Yeah, it's been a while since I've told the story. And a lot of things I talk about, people still don't even understand what it was or what it was back in the day, because it just, they're newer and stuff like that. But I was working as a project manager at an architectural firm, and I just wanted to start writing and blogging. Blogging at that point was sort of in its infancy. And there were, things like movable type and Google's Blogspot, and, WordPress was a thing back then. But I started with Google's Blogspot, which is their blogger platform now. And somewhere along the way, I ran into somebody online who said, "Hey, you should check out WordPress. It's, it's a little bit more sophisticated. You could do more stuff with it." And I was like, "Yeah, sure. Okay." So I tried to install it, couldn't figure it out. So I did the whole, Google my way through all of it. And I was like, okay, now that I get this is kind of cool. I'm kind of glad that I learned how this works and whatnot. It's all new internet stuff from back then. And I remember trying to go through, and I remember WPEngine.net or something like that, wherever at the time the free theme directory was hosted. And I couldn't really find anything I liked. And so I just took one of the themes down, and I'm like, well, maybe I can try to change some things inside these files. Didn't know anything about HTML or CSS, but I was like, well, let me just try, right? And I just started hacking my way through the theme, sort of reformatted it. My OCD didn't like the line breaks and the indentation haphazardly that were in the theme file. So I started there. That hasn't changed to date. The tendency to be obsessive around formatting of code, but just learning, what a hex code was and how to change a color or spacing through the theme and the theme style sheet kind of gave me to a point where I was like, okay, well, I created something and now I feel like this is mine, right? It was sort of like forking something, but I didn't even know what that meant at the time, right? Because open source didn't mean anything to me. I was just doing a thing. And so, the fast forwarded version was I started developing free themes, giving them out for distribution, and then customizing them as a moonlighting sort of gig. And from there, Revolution, the theme, the design came about. And when that was rejected by a real estate agent in Boston, it was an opportunity that probably changed for certain the trajectory of my life, but likely that of others as well.
Yeah. So we were talking before we started recording that maybe there's a lot of people in WordPress today that don't remember those, but I think it's important to reflect back. That time back then, Brian, was the wild, wild west. Like, movable type had done their thing, and there was this mass exodus over to WordPress, which is, I think, one of the biggest, parts of WordPress's success was the leaders at that community made kind of a misstep, and it was an exodus over here. But that produced this. There was cool code coming in, and things in WordPress, but there was this That's what I remember finding is this desert of good themes.
Yep. It was
And
rough.
that's where you were rocking, man. That's how I found you. I think I found you through a free theme. And it was like, wait, who's this guy? I like his design. And then we struck up a friendship that was on this thing called G Talk.
Yep.
Okay, so fast forward, then you started Studio Press, 2008. And then tell us a snippet of that. I think many people know that, but let's make sure we cover that. And then you started what became Studio Press.
Correct.
And you want to share that little snippet of story?
Yeah. So originally it was all called Revolution. And at the time I didn't know anything about intellectual property. And so I just named something what I wanted to name it. And unfortunately, the product of having it become successful is it gets put on the radar of other technology and software companies. And so the short of it is we rebranded to Studio Press as a result of a cease and desist letter I received from a company in the United Kingdom. It probably would never have gone anywhere, but it was not worth my hassle to fight it. So we rebranded as Studio Press. Not too long into that is when we made some hires. Nathan Rice, who you know was one of them, and we sort of built this framework called Genesis together, which was a theme framework, child parent theme system that essentially ran the tenure of Studio Press's glory days, and for the better part of 10 years. And it's 5 years. Gosh, hard to believe. 5 years in June will mark the anniversary of the acquisition of Studio Press from WPEngine. So there's a lot of in between all of that for sure. But yeah, it's still here. Hard to believe.
Well, I want to set that too, just in case to show how far you back and what you've done, part of that. But then I want to catch up too. What are you doing today, and what's interesting? I know I've seen some things you put out with full size editing. I'm like, Brian's geeking out over there doing this thing. But tell me what you're doing now and what you're interested in with WordPress.
Yeah. So before I get to that point, one of the reasons we sold Studio Press was at the time our partnership team didn't want to necessarily, or because we had other things on our agenda, we didn't want to figure out what this Gutenberg thing was coming, right? It was at the time it was just announced, this editor thing. And I told our team, I'm like, look, either we need to lean in and really double down and invest into where WordPress is going with this and what that means for our product and what we're working on, or we need to just, kind of call it a day and focus on our other projects. Some of us were already doing personal things, and it was time we kind of wanted to go do our own thing anyways, individuals. And so we set out to find some people to see if there was interest in acquiring Studio Press. And so we sold Studio Press in summer of 2018. And I was like, maybe that was it. Maybe that was the extent of my WordPress tenure. And I was going to try to do other things, and I was interested in just trying different stuff, because at that point, for 10 or 12 years, I'd been just doing WordPress theme design pretty much every day. And so so a couple of years went on. I did some agency work. I messed around with some real estate tech ideas and whatnot. Certainly never forgot about WordPress. It continued to always use WordPress, followed along with, the developments of Gutenberg and the editor and all of that. And it was about 2 summers ago, I came across an article on WP Tavern from Justin Tadlock, kind of showing what block patterns were and how they work, and sort of and I just literally tweeted this a few minutes ago. One of my favorite parts of it all is sort of the replication aspect, where you can copy and paste, and things happen so much easier and quicker now. And when I saw and understood what patterns were, sort of immediately stopped me in my tracks, and sort of was the seed that was planted for Frost, which is a WordPress theme now that WPEngine owns. And we're using that on our developer relations team to sort of showcase the possibilities of the editor and use it for educational purposes. And so, love WordPress, probably never been as excited about what it is and what it can do as, I'm more excited today than I've ever been. I get to do design related things around it. And I just really, the landscape has changed, the competitive landscape, right? You've got Webflow and Figma and all of those types of tools that now sort of, and we can get to that, sort of pose existential threats as we try to work our way through sort of all these phasing, that I'm still bullish. And I think 43% of the internet still uses it. So on some level, there's some security involved, but we want to be the change. That's why we exist, our team at WPEngine.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear someone else say that, because I'm right with you. There are existential threats to WordPress. You mentioned Webflow, and I talk about that a lot. We with AJ Morris and I looked at it a couple of weeks, and I was like, wow. When you look out at the landscape today, so much tech just accelerates at an impossible pace. And I've looked at it gone, okay, WordPress needs to kind of reestablish ourselves. But I'm so happy to hear, though, that you see opportunity and hope with, and I hear it from what you just said is like full site editing, Gutenberg. And I'm curious your thoughts about that, where we are now, where we're going. You've had a big presence, obviously, in design and theme work within WordPress and been a champion for that for a long time. But I want to hear what you're excited about and passionate about, and why. Why this full set editing? Why Frost, for instance, the patterns, what you're working on, what you're thinking about, what you're dreaming of.
We all live in a no code, easy click, drag and drop sort of society. And like all of the stuff that you and I built, like back in the day, right? Like was all hard coded, and even the PHP files, the text, it was all hard coded. And I'm like, to update your website, you'd have to go into a file and change text in a PHP file, which nobody ever wants to do unless you built some sort of GUI for it. And so like throughout the years, even as I look back on what we did with Genesis, there were still elements, it was not ideal to, at the time, I guess it was the only option, but looking back on it, it was not ideal to create a front page file with a bunch of widget areas, and you managed your homepage by way of like 8 different widgets. And then, inevitably somebody would say, well, I want to replicate this page and use it for like an inner page. And like, well, okay, you got to recreate the file, re-register 8 more widgets. It was a mess. And so where we're at today and why it excites me so much is that it's so easy to do all of the things that have been historically hard or difficult in WordPress. And of course, when you compare them to some of these other software technologies like Webflow, which are even easier than WordPress has ever been and may ever will be, that's kind of where you're like, okay, this is great that WordPress can do this, but like there's a ton of other companies. And of course, we haven't even talked about the page builders yet, which within the WordPress ecosystem sort of precursored where we're at now with the capabilities. I'm a framework kind of person. And when I understand how something works and kind of can work within and build product around, like that really excites me. That brings me joy. It allows me to like exercise and flex some of the design muscles because I've got a system that can accommodate like changing and modifications so quickly. And just that's part of, I think, what excites me the most, just having the ability to deliver something to an end user who can, make it their own and have a demo, like without having to like spend an hour recreating it. So just looking within the WordPress kind of product system itself, just where we're at now is so much more. The capabilities are so much more than they've ever been.
So full site editing, I haven't dug in fully to it, but I see the promise that it holds. And then you mentioned like Gutenberg with blocks and patterns. So much potential there.
Yes.
But it kind of harkens back to when we started. There's opportunity here. People need to come in like you and others. I think of Rich Tabor and you and different people in the design space and go, here's what could be of this. Here are practical applications of that. Tell me a little bit about your work with Frost in that. Is Frost kind of that your R&D lab for doing this kind of stuff?
Yeah, it is. A lot of people who followed me in StudioPress back in the day know of a gentleman, a very talented designer named Rafal Tamal. He was our lead designer at StudioPress for a long time. He's on his own now. He actually created a thing called Design Kit. It's a Figma product that allows sort of like a wireframe system inside of it where, he's got a library of various components of a website: headers, footers, featured section, hero sections, testimonials, all that kind of stuff. And the idea behind that was through Figma, you can create files and do mockups for clients and stuff like that very quickly because you have a library of these sections to work with. Well, when I realized what block patterns were, which are essentially the same thing, just sort of the WordPress coded version of these things in Figma. I was like, wouldn't it be really cool if you could set up a system that basically had like a library to choose from where you could insert into WordPress's dashboard. Like, I want to insert this header with this section and that section, and just like top to bottom, build a page out within a matter of a few clicks. And so in its infancy, that's what Frost set out to be. Frost was a very vanilla sort of non-opinionated design, black and white wireframe setup, which has a bunch of patterns in there, several headers, several footers, all the kinds of sections that you could think of building. And the idea behind it was just to, if anything, help us inform ourselves on how this all works, how it can be used to like build sites. And then WPEngine brought that in when I was hired. And so it's been sort of like our toy within developer relations to sort of showcase things and build things. We're going to hopefully move that into a little bit more production ready staging here pretty soon, so that people just can use it beyond its current capabilities. But yeah, so Frost is just sort of our experimental thing. We stay up to date with all of the latest updates that Gutenberg, the plugin, brings. So once Gutenberg ships, Frost has a dependency on it, so we can like leverage all of the things that are coming. So we can show people how it works, how it's built, how it can be used. And so it's been sort of like an anchor inside our team.
I think back about, I still create WordPress websites this way, but of course the Gutenberg tools has gotten really good, and
Yep.
I'm fully embraced Gutenberg. But back in the day, you had a theme. You're talking about changing CSS and stuff like that. And as I've talked to a number of agencies doing client work, I always think about workflow.
Yep.
Not to contrast it necessarily, but how do you envision the designer developers workflow in WordPress with site editing? How do you approach, I guess might be a better way to ask it, about building a WordPress website today in 20th anniversary in 2023, building a website project out? I'm just curious. I learned a lot of the theme stuff that I know from you in the early days. So I'm curious. I'm going to ask the same question 16, 17 years later.
Much of what I do is sort of a do as I say, not as I do thing, just because I understand how things work so well behind the scenes that I shortcut a lot of things I think other folks have the ability to do. And that's not a flex necessarily. And it's probably a drawback, just a sort of a flaw in the way I like to do things. Personally, I just, Frost is a blank slate theme. And so generally, like, I take it and fork it anytime I want to do anything with it. Like if I'm doing a client site, I'll take Frost. First thing I'll do is rename everything for the client site, similar to what we would do. You rename the theme folder, rename the functions thing, so that, it feels like it's something that's being custom built for a customer. Now, you talk about agencies, and that's sort of like what we've encountered here. Obviously, agencies matter a lot to our business at WPEngine. And it's actually the subset of people who've probably pushed back the most on Gutenberg and this block editor because of workflow, because they've got established workflows where teams have to sort of adhere to certain policies and certain standards and practices. And so it's harder. Many agencies just are built off of page builders, right? They are not built off of, but they leverage page builders. So you're asking them to effectively change their entire workflow, regardless of how cool and how easy it is. It's still a change. It's still a time investment. And so for the most part, in our experience with our developer relations efforts, we're realizing that agencies are the ones that sort of resist the most, and that's okay. It's understandable. But we're also sort of slowly just demonstrating, hey, the things that you're doing now can also be done with WordPress core capabilities. It can also be done quicker. And so while, yes, there's an investment to learn how it works, but the expedition of workflow is, I think, what excites me the most, sort of having library of patterns and things to draw from. What used to take us 10 hours to build a site can take us 2, right? And so these are the kinds of things that I get excited about, not only for myself, but like for other people, to say, hey, here's a new workflow that could actually be advantageous to your business. It'll help you scale, things like that.
What I admire about what you and your team did with Genesis is you created a workflow, for people to, and they're still fanatics about Genesis, and for good reason. And I'm curious, like, what do we need to do as a community to help that? we want WordPress to still be the primary tool that people build web projects on. What are the things that need to happen? And I gather a lot of it's the work you're doing today, but I'm curious, what are those hallmarks to make? You all did it once. WordPress is really good, like, has that workflow established, but we need some new workflows to embrace WordPress, full site editing, Gutenberg, yada, yada. And what do you think those elements that need to happen?
A lot of it's educate. Go ahead.
For those agencies, because I think about they're the people out there helping create that growth we're talking about with WordPress that's sustained us for so long. So
yeah, a lot of it's education. I mean, the WordPress Learn team is doing quite a bit, like as the project itself. We see them now, GoDaddy, Automatic, WPEngine, these developer relations teams that are starting to form really are sort of a demonstration of giving back to the community, right? Five for the future. Because a lot of the work, at least that we're doing, is contributions to WordPress, testing things, helping make it better so that just the project as a whole can succeed. So education, demonstrations, workshops, the WordPress online at Meetup is a very big thing. A lot of the people who are doing that stuff are community members. People, some sponsored, some not. I mean, we obviously get to do some of that as part of our job. Just demonstrating in just various forms, right? Because there's all kinds of flavors of WordPress. There's people who are just using it as like end users, and there are people who are building Nassau websites with it. So we've got to serve different subsets of people and to educate and show in different ways. I think one of the biggest pushbacks, I think it was WordPress 6.0, or at least this is maybe when it was shipping, was the sort of ability to lock blocks, this whole block locking API, which was an agency pushback. Like, hey, this is great for people who are like tinkering around, but the last thing we want to do is sort of equip our end user, our client, with the ability to break their site by just toying with, settings and, things like that and buttons. And so WordPress added, and they're still adding more capabilities for block locking, which basically means you can set up a whole section of a website and just block locking them out of being able to manipulate it. Like, hey, can't like move the columns around, but you can change the text, right? And that's something that would be very appropriate to turn over to a client. Sort of protects the integrity of the site, but allows them to sort of maintain and manage it themselves. So there's just a lot of flavors of that. And documentation is probably the one thing that lacks the most, because everything is moving so quickly, like things are changing mid-flight and all of that. So it's hard to even do some of this stuff, because by the time it's like, the joke, the Golden Gate Bridge, once you get done painting the Golden Gate Bridge, you'd have to go back and start again because it takes so long to do it. It's similar with documentation. By the time you like produce something and show someone how to do that, like the site editor screen or the user interface changes. And so therefore, like, you got to update it and things like that. So I think we're at a really good point. 6.2 should deliver and sort of level off a lot of this stuff that's been kind of coming so quickly, which I'm really excited about, because now it's more about, okay, now that things are stabilizing a lot, now we can convince people it's trustworthy software to use. We can feel better educating people and showcasing how things work, because sort of the screenshots don't tend to change as much. And so now it's more just a matter of kind of rolling up our sleeves and doing the work and showing people how it can be used, how it can be beneficial to their company or business, and effectively help them change their workflows to leverage inevitably what's here and what's still coming.
Well, I know when we started out, anybody, the beauty of WordPress is anybody could pretty much, with that 5-minute install, create something on the web and have it in this database and all these tools there, and over time. And I think I know you've seen it too, but it's just the Squarespace, Wix, Weebly effect. This tool underneath, these sets of tools underneath like a Webflow, and start to really, I would say erode, but like that market. Even though I still prefer to do it here, I'm not going to go to Squarespace Weekly. I know that, like you said, I know what I'm dealing with here. The unfortunate thing is, sad for me, is that I wonder about that market. But your work at WPEngine, you all do great project work, and with the hosting that you all provide, but your clients are doing really cool projects. And I've seen this like section out of the client work side of things. This do-it-yourselfer still there. Somebody preferred just to use Squarespace and Weebly, and that they go to WordPress. But then I see two things, particularly in post as kind of what I call a boutique agency. They're doing $25, $50, $75,000 projects with the kind of size of business, that someone is hiring someone to do it with more complexity.
Yep.
And then I see another, and I don't have these perfectly out, but I see these broad strokes of enterprise at scale project, which is awesome. Like I can't imagine someone trying to deliver an enterprise project and going, wait, there's 50 people that could touch this, 500 people. I don't know,
Yeah.
That's one thing I've seen that I kind of, I'll just tell you as we go way back, is sad.
Yeah.
This bottom market's going on. But I'm curious what you're seeing, particularly with your work at WPEngine too, is the kind of work that's being done on this scales up from the, I have an idea, I can roll my website out with this thing called WordPress, to more complex type organizations and things like that. What are you seeing with in those realms?
I see, well, WPEngine for sure. And I think just WordPress in general, generally gravitating, even though Gutenberg itself, the editor's intent was really to accommodate sort of the DIYers, right? The tinkerers and the Wix and Squarespace types. WordPress's bread and butter has primarily been, even though it started as a blogging platform, really, it's a really good CMS. And there's a lot just because of its open source nature, all of the plugins that exist, the ecosystem, the extensibility. I don't think that is the market that I think will be able to sustain sort of all of what's going on the most, because Squarespace and Wix and Webflow, these are all catering more towards like the single user, very small boutique, brochure type sites of things. Anything beyond that, those softwares can't even come close. Shopify is about like the only exception. I mean, it's very specifically built for e-commerce and to scale with e-commerce, but there's not a lot beyond that. And I think that's where WordPress will kind of ultimately stay safe, which doesn't necessarily feel good for the boutique agency who's now losing out to people building their own sites on some of this other stuff. But and so I think there needs to be sort of a mind shift to some degree. Not saying a boutique agency has to like all of a sudden become 10 up, but just there is a change. And I think for better or worse, it's going to sort of hinge on who responds to what's here and all of that. Because I think at some point a client will come along and say, I've heard of WordPress and this new block thing. I need a site built that way. And what we tell everybody we talk to, which is quite a bit of people, at some point you need to that's your value add that you could build with, we call it modern WordPress, right? And if you say, well, I could build it in classic press, like that's not going to ultimately be a great plan of action.
Yeah. I'm curious what you're seeing at the enterprise. It's a space we both have friends that have played on that level for the longest time. And I always, when I hear enterprise, I get excited about WordPress, but I know there's challenges there too. But what are you seeing with your enterprise agency clients at WPEngine?
I personally don't interact that much with like enterprise at that level, mainly because, my heart and affection generally kind of like lends itself towards like the small town, less Walmart and more, Joe's grocery store sort of thing. I just generally like to work with people who are in smaller scale. I know we've got all kinds of several, just talented people and, client services and things like that around our enterprise business. And I know we do a lot of great things. We've got huge contracts and stuff like that. So obviously we're very invested in WordPress and where it goes. We're very, interested in trying to like make the hosting and sort of the website experience altogether better. So I can't speak specifically to like what we're seeing, right? Like that's probably for someone else to answer. But I know that people, there's people are starting to ask questions like, hey, what does all this mean for us? Right. And it's not necessarily our team at developer relations to answer those questions, but like as a company, we need to say, hey, this is what WordPress's trajectory means for enterprise type sites.
Yeah. Well, a lot of those boutique agencies I've talked to in the post status community doing so cool things. Have carved out these cool niches I didn't envision, doing membership sites and e-commerce with WordPress. Pandemic took a lot of in-person physical location businesses, and they had to figure out, how do we do web? And I thought, I didn't like what everybody had to go through, but I like the fact that now a lot of these physical in-person businesses have web presence that adds, they have something that kind of extends their business. And I love hearing those stories. And I imagine that's a lot of the people you're talking about that you work with too, showing how they can use this awesome tool called WordPress to really deliver excellent client work.
Yeah, I have been asked a lot lately, like, where do I see the successes happening sort of with people within WordPress, and from a product side, but also from like a service side. I think, we've started to see this over the last 5 years or so, sort of this niching of sort of, capabilities. Sarah Dunn, she's a WordPress person that a lot of people know. She sort of niched down into like the wedding industry, and she like completely owns it there. And she was one of the first people that I really was like, like intellectually, you're like, oh, don't niche down, like be, jack of all trades, right? And so when I started to like really understand like where WordPress is going, and I feel this wholeheartedly that right now, like the people who are going to rise above are the people who say, I don't want to just build WordPress websites. I want to build education WordPress websites, or I want to, be the e-commerce guru, or I want to become the LMS ninja, like where you become known for like, and being an expert in providing a solution. And with all of what WordPress can do, and this is sort of like talking about like blocks and plugins and things like that, is people who will go into a certain market and provide and just take WordPress beyond its sort of general capabilities and say, I'm going to either build, a plugin suite or a block suite that caters to a very specific subset of people. And then that's where the value truly comes.
So and I love that too. It's 500 flavors times exponential of cool stuff that's happening that I didn't even know was possible, but it is possible because they showed that you can do it. So I want to kind of turn our attention now so you've seen a lot in WordPress over the time you've been involved. What are some of the things, looking back, the hallmarks, things that have happened that showcase who we are as a community and what the software is in the world? As you reflect back, what are the things that come to mind? It can totally be theme and design related, or they can be general, but I'm asking these questions a lot of people that have been around for a long time, because I think it's very important to reflect back and go, this was good. Now the second part would be reimagining the future, right? So as you reflect back, what are a couple of those key things, that moments in our WordPress history or whatever, that really made the difference?
As you know, I have an 18-year-old son. And so a lot of our time as a family,
Can't believe it, by the way.
I know, is talking about like how life used to be for us as, Gen Xers, and what life is like, for kids nowadays, right? Zach and I were just talking about like social media and how he just doesn't like the pressures that it brings. And I was like, well, back in our day, right, we didn't have to worry about that, even though there's benefits to it, right? And so I think WordPress has some similar elements, right? Like back when we started, there was a lot of true co-opetition, right? We talked about that word, sort of the co-opetition part of it, where we were all helping each other. You and I were competing, but like we're on Google Chat, like comparing notes on how we're succeeding and what we're doing and what works. And I feel like to some degree, life was simpler back then, right? Sort of cliche. It just, the complexities were lower. It was a smaller market. Obviously it wasn't 43% of the internet, but it was certainly enough. A handful of people doing things. And then I think the success of the premium theme industry sort of sparked sort of as sort of like a marker here, sort of the initial growth of then the plugin market, right? Gravity Forum's a good example. WooCommerce, kind of like the early plugins that say, hey, you guys do themes, we're going to do functionality, right? We're going to sort of find our niche with providing functionality for people who are using WordPress. And so you kind of go into like the growth and the explosion of the plugin market, which arguably could have dwarfed the theme market because there's just so many use cases for it. And so like, that's like the first thing. I was like, okay, that's kind of like when we all started to grow up, right? We kind of like, we graduated college and we're like, we're in the real world now. We've all got real world businesses, like companies making millions of dollars doing things. This is not just like a hobby software anymore, that an ecosystem was formed. And from that, like companies like WPEngine, GoDaddy, Pagely, all of the people, you see these acquisitions that so-and-so sold for $100 million. And I think people start to realize, okay. And that's when, like a lot of stuff, like that's when like sort of the greed comes into it, like the VC, oh, there's real money to be made here. And so it starts to sort of taint the innocentness of what we got to experience. I often tell Zach, I'm like, man, life in the 80s was great and y'all missed out. And I feel bad for that, and I feel the same way with WordPress, that some people who are like, I just started like 3 years ago. And, like you jump in and it's like living in Tokyo. There's like people like bustling and like cars everywhere and like transportation. And it's like, the good old days, like Hope Floats. Remember that movie, like small town Americana. Like I miss that. I still miss it even now. I'm like, again, one of the reasons we sold Studio Press, I didn't know we could compete. And that was from a person who effectively created the market that he was trying to compete in. And so, lots of stuff that come into play. And this dovetails into all of the iceberg and mental health stuff, which certainly is a real thing, but maybe for another podcast, but lots to deal with there.
I love the emphasis on cooperation, that spirit of WordPress and open source, and those of us that were starting product companies back and then as a real spirit of cooperation. And I think we need to return to that today, for sure. So I'm so glad you mentioned that, because that's the software is cool. The community is what lights it up and makes it magic. And then people going, I think the sub part of what I take from yours too is innovation, an idea to do something that solves a problem that's really good for the business, that has made the business of WordPress what it is today. Mm-hmm. And I think there's challenges we talked about with WordPress and the web, but that I'm excited because I think there's always somebody new coming into the community that has an idea, has something that's going to break the innovation wall down. I think about page builders, like you mentioned earlier, Beaver Builder and Elementor, and going, when I left iThemes, I was trying to rebuild my site, and I went and used one of those tools, and I thought, holy cow, this is what we wanted, what we tried to do. Yeah. But they did it really well, obviously by their success. And you go, that's the cool stuff we need now, a return back to that cooperation with innovation. Mm-hmm. And what we do at Postat is want to always make sure we have a healthy, vibrant, growing business ecosystem, which means we do want WordPress to be successful anyway, because we love it. We're zealots, of open source software. Okay, so I take first is cooperation. What else?
Sometimes it feels like a blur, community innovation, just a lot of that sort of dovetails in and around, it's an ebb and flow in just the product life cycle and the community life cycle. Trying to think if there's anything specific. Genesis for us was obviously a big thing. It really formulated the whole idea of an ecosystem of developers and builders rallying around a project, who themselves found, co-opetition to help, rising tide lifts all boats, right? You had a bunch of people who were developing with the same software, effectively competitors against one another, yet they were the ones who were like referring business to one another and helping answer questions in a forum on how to do stuff, because it really, and I've really tried to operate this personally, is the sort of pay it forward mentality, which is someone was there before you and they wrote about how to do it and you learned from that and you figured out how to do it. And so like the next person who comes along should have some artifact of what you learned so that they can then learn how to do it. And then, sort of the chain goes on. But yeah,
what about with the software in particular? Obviously we met and we did this thing because we were drawn to the software that was enabling us to do things. Are there, from the software side, things you look back and go, you know what, that point was a critical shift for the core software that enabled something? And I have my own thoughts, but I'm curious yours, particularly because you've always come at it with a design perspective, and how do we, this workflow side of like, how do we produce these things that are maybe in our head with this software?
So I would say Genesis was one for me personally. And then obviously Gutenberg has been like the second big one. Genesis enabled me to do a lot of the things that were sort of pain points, specifically around themes and designs and website stuff like that. So Genesis was like the first like extension of WordPress that said, oh, I can now do all these things that like I felt were limitations, even though there were several things that were like suboptimal about it. At the time, it was all we could do. Why I'm so excited now is because like all of those things that I thought were difficult, even though we could work our way through them, is now possible to do. There are things I wish I could do better, right? I wish I could build blocks. I wish I could build plugins. And so like I have personally a lot of ideas that I want to execute on, but I'm like, all I could do is mock them up in Figma, and that's the extent of it. And so I wish I wish I knew how to build stuff better. And I'm sure a lot of other people are sort of in the same boat.
Well, okay. So you mentioned Gutenberg, which I think is critical. I was curious if you would mention Gutenberg, but talk to me a little bit about Gutenberg and what you're seeing, particularly with that part of the project and into the future. What are your hopes and dreams for that the software goes to enable people like you, other designers, and even me, I would say, still benefiting from all this. Thoughts about Gutenberg now into the future?
So Gutenberg for me really helped make product building and product delivery a better and more delightful experience, right? Like I could build something that looked good, but telling somebody how to do it in the way it had to be done was really problematic. Documentation back in the, like, gotta open these files and do all these things. That is really not great for somebody who's not versed in WordPress or PHP or anything like that, even though it was the only way to do it. And I sometimes have a local copy of the original Revolution theme, and every once in a while I just pop it open for nostalgic purposes, and I'm like, oh my God, how did we even live or thrive off of this software, which is extremely embarrassing to think about. And so what Gutenberg, when I say Gutenberg, we're talking, what originally started out as sort of the whole thing. Now it's actually the experimental plugin, but the whole idea of the block editing experience and full site editing really allows us as product builders to do things that we can turn over to people that they can then easily work with themselves. And that's the part I think that excites me the most, is not only can I sort of work within the system and design something that just kind of looks really well, you empower people who otherwise have not been able to sort of do that for themselves by saying, hey, you could change colors like in the WordPress dashboard with like one click versus like having to open a style sheet. But then you got to go through FTP, right? Because maybe some, hosts shut down the ability to edit file, like all of this stuff that was like, I still don't understand how we got to where we did, because there were so many hoops to jump through. But what excites me the most, though, is just the ability to, and now the pattern stuff and the harmonization of the post and page editor screens, like the traditional WP admin and the site editor, which is essentially the merging of them just makes it feel like you're doing one thing. Because I think a lot of people were like, oh, well, Squarespace is so good because it's like there's parity, visual parity between front end and back end. Like I just go to my thing and I type and I hit save and it just looks the way it does on the web. WordPress is not like that, right? The classic editor was like literally just a Google Doc, but like on the front end, it was like this beautiful design. That separation is now closing. And we're getting to a point now where at some point people are going to be like, they won't know the front end from the back end, and it'll all be just like an experience, and they'll be empowered significantly more than they've ever been.
That's cool. I love hearing about things like block locking, for instance, that's showing responsiveness to the community, that's really leveraging this as a tool. And the game over for me for Gutenberg was I was trying to create a button, and I barely knew how to create HTML back in the day. And I went to look for a plugin, only to realize Gutenberg does those things now.
Yep.
In natively. And then that was the point I was like, okay, now I'm stepping in, gonna embrace this thing called Gutenberg. And I'm really curious to see, I know Frost and some of the work you've done particularly was, we need a base to start those workflows. to use some of these tools. And it'll be cool to see all of that be fleshed out, creatively innovated, along the way to keep this thing called WordPress growing. All right, Brian, thanks, man. This was really good nostalgia, but I really wanted to get your perspectives on these things. I think it's important for us at the 20-year mark. I mean, 20 years on the internet is ancient.
Yes,
and so, the question I keep going is, how do we keep doing the good work of democratizing publishing on the web? Some of these things, I not just because of nostalgia, I love the fact that WordPress could be used from a blogger all the way up to a Fortune 500 company and across the world to free people up. And I think now is the time for us to kind of remember some of these hallmarks that made us who we are, and then reimagine what that looks like in the next phase. And I'm excited for the WordPress community and that you're still here doing cool work, cutting edge, trying to like break things and push them past where they want to be and show others that it can be done too. So anyway, thanks, Brian, for being on today at Post Status Draft. And by the way, so what is the role at WPEngine that you do specifically now?
Yes, I am a developer advocate on the developer relations team, which basically, as it stands now, we have two different developer relations team. One is for headless WordPress, which is a little bit more on like the product side at WPEngine, and our subset, which is Nick Diego, Damon Cook, and myself. Sam Munoz is our community manager. We are essentially focused on the adoption of full site editing and the block editor. We use Frost as a way to sort of demonstrate that stuff. We're supporting some of our product teams internally. But, when I was hired by Heather Brunner, our CEO, she, asked if I would be energized, in a role of this sort. And I said, Heather, I love WordPress, I love design, and I love community. So if this role sort of touches all three of those in various forms, I'm all for it. And, it's been a great fit. I love working here, and really look forward to all the work we have ahead of us.
Cool. Thanks, Ryan, for being here today. And thanks everybody else for listening in to another episode of Post Status Draft. And WordPress is 20. This is a really good story and one I like to hear again and again. And it's still possible within WordPress in the future.